Welcome to CEO Builder Channel. I'm Rich Tyson. Hey, we recently celebrated Labor Day. Of course, that's a national holiday celebrating the individual and collective efforts of American workers. It also recognizes the American labor movement that gave rise to unions. This movement began in the late 19th century with workers forming bargaining units, whereby legal agreements were negotiated with business owners, securing compensation, benefits, and working conditions. Most historians believe that such trade unions were a natural outgrowth of questionable business practices that were often employed by what were called in the late 1800s the robber barons. Those who are described as such include John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who also, in fairness, were quite generous with their philanthropic initiatives. These men created vast amounts of personal wealth by destroying competitors through predatory pricing and then demanded exorbitant prices when they emerged with monopolies. They also often turned a blind eye to the welfare of the majority of the employees who labored in producing their wealth. The unabashed hubris of these captains of industry inevitably brought a strong reaction from both government and labor. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed into federal law in 1890, prohibiting activities deemed to be anti-competitive and giving the federal government the right to investigate and bust trust being the monopolies. The reaction of labor was also significant. After decades of what many everyday laborers felt was oppressive, the labor movement took root. Workers anxiously engaged together to protect their common interests of better wages, reasonable hours, and safe working conditions. Early labor leaders saw two distinct classes of Americans. The robber barons were clearly in the former category, and their employees were largely in the latter. Activist leadership saw their role as diminishing the gap between these social classes. In that regard, unions gravitated toward confrontations, often using strikes as a weapon to bring their rich adversaries to the terms of their demands. Increasingly, unionism also became an instrument for Marxist extremists who desired to motivate the working class to revolution. Participation in labor unions was strong, even pervasive, from the late 19th century until the 1970s, when organized labor began to decline. Between 1975 and 1985, union membership decreased by over 5 million workers. By 1990, less than 17% of American workers were union members, about half of the participation rate of the early 1950s. So, what are we to learn from the history of organized labor in the United States? Consider these observations. Those who gave birth to the union movement were not labor leaders. They were the oppressive, greedy robber barons and other business owners who turned a blind eye to the wages, benefits, hours, and working conditions of their employees. This is one of history's most telling examples of the law of unintended consequences. The captains of industry saw only their burgeoning wealth as the consequence of their actions. They failed to recognize the inevitable reaction of both labor and government. Failing to self-regulate, they had regulation forced upon them by Congress and unions. Thankfully, the majority of union members did not fall into the militant camp of Marxists. They did, however, emerge from the early days of unionism as a force to be dealt with by business owners and management. While this has had many laudatory effects for workers, it has also led to the demise of some ventures when the demands of labor rendered those businesses untenable. Unions must recognize that they share a common interest with the companies their members work for, that of keeping the enterprise alive, profitable, and providing jobs. The decline in union membership since the 1970s is indicative of more enlightened treatment of employees by business owners and management. Many union members have felt little need for collective bargaining since the key issues represented in that bargaining have largely been addressed. Feeling no need for a paid outside advocate, they have voted with their feet and have left the unions. I believe we must learn two important lessons from the history of the U.S. labor movement. First, we should recognize how far we've come from the robber baron days. Worker conditions have improved immensely. Without any animosity toward unions, it's a good thing that many workers now feel no need for them. Second, we should consider the story of U.S. unions as a cautionary tale. If we don't learn from that history, we will surely repeat it. Management today must recognize that we will never accomplish our desired business outcomes without the labor of others. We must treat them, all of them, with respect. They should have a voice in how we do business, how they are compensated, their work hours, and the safety and comfort of their work environment. In short, we need to use the golden rule as our standard of leadership. When we do unto others as we would have done unto ourselves, they generally reciprocate. Businesses thrive as employees thrive. In these days of extraordinary turmoil from disease, societal unrest, and natural disasters, we all need to recognize that the most significant casualties of these uncertain times may ultimately be our commitment to hard work, self-reliance, self-restraint, and respect for one another. Thank you.